Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University School of Law, SOL. Certificate in International Humanitarian Law, SIL. BLE 036 Application of International Humanitarian Law. Block 1 Who may apply IHL? Unit 1 How do states apply IHL? 1.1 Introduction. Undoubtedly, the obligation to respect and to ensure respect for humanitarian principles in all circumstances has acquired a special status not only in United Nations law, but more generally in the international legal order. This provision consequently belongs to a select group of norms and principles held by the international community to be of cardinal importance for the promotion of elementary considerations of humanity. The Martens Clause, 51, is one such. And the obligation to respect and to ensure respect is another. Such norms play what may be termed a constitutional role in a system of collective security, where humanitarian values have become a reason for the adoption of a large number of measures. Such a constitutional role is even more important given the proliferation of sui generis conflicts in which a wide range of non-state contenders, for example, local warlords, drug traffickers, can be acknowledged as fully fledged parties. Hence, South Africa's representative to the United Nations, speaking on behalf of the non-aligned group, recently referred to common Article 1 in much the same way as one would to a constitution, as an instrument of both great importance and flexibility, stating that it constitutes the collective responsibility of the United Nations. Another trend to be noted is the increasing role played by the United Nations Security Council, a body that has become the main proponent of Common Article 1. This entails a risk of selectivity insofar as political considerations might prevent the Council from acting unconditionally, i.e., in all circumstances where action is called for. Similarly, there remains a risk that the Council's recourse to humanitarian assistance may become a pawn of political interests, rather than the object of meaningful political action. To prevent this, the obligation to ensure respect for humanitarian law should be interpreted in a broad sense, so as to also include the search for peaceful means of conflict resolution based on respect for the values and principles of the UN Charter. While preventive action may be one such means, promoting meaningful negotiations might indeed be another. 1.2 Objectives. After reading this unit, you should be able to times explain how states apply IHL, times discuss role and scope of the Common Article 1 of the Genera Conventions, and times discuss role of the military manuals in the application of IHL. 1. 3. Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions. At a time when the international community as a whole, states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, is searching for an international public policy for the promotion of humanitarian considerations, it is important to identify the legal principles on which such action could be based. This is all the more relevant as recourse to armed force is increasingly viewed as a means to an end in that context. When it comes to promoting values and interests of a collective character, the rudimentary nature of the international legal order is obvious. It is a system better acquainted, if not to say more at ease, with bilateral and contractual instruments and techniques. Notions such as jus cogens, erga omnes, obligations and international crimes of the state are all important concepts. However, if they are to have due effect, there is a need for legal institutions and mechanisms to give them their full meaning. In that regard, the four Geneva Conventions for the Protection of War Victims of 12 August 1949 and their two additional protocols of 1977 offer some interesting prospects. Some 50 years ago, the drafting of these conventions led to the inclusion in their common Article 1 of a provision that provides the nucleus for a system of collective responsibility. It has since evolved and has furthermore attracted considerable attention. For this reason, the scope and content of that provision will first be assessed. The various dimensions it has acquired throughout its existence, and especially in the course of the last decade, will then be highlighted. Comments on the quasi-constitutional nature of such a norm in a society in search of a collective identity will be offered in conclusion. 1.3.1 Scope and Content of Common Article 1. Article 1 common to the four Geneva Conventions reads as follows: The high contracting parties undertake to respect and to ensure respect for the present convention in all circumstances. This provision was reiterated in Article 1, Paragraph 4 of Additional Protocol I. As such, the obligation to respect and ensure respect, which will also be referred to as Common Article 1, applies to international conflicts and, indeed, to non-international conflicts to the extent that the latter are covered by Common Article 3, while conflicts of a non-international character as defined by Additional Protocol 11 are not explicitly covered by the obligation to respect and to ensure respect, they can nonetheless be considered as indirectly falling within the purview of the provision, insofar as Protocol 11 is merely an elaboration of Common Article 3 of the four Geneva Conventions, a fact stated in its Article 1, Paragraph 1. The obligation to respect and to ensure respect for humanitarian law is a two-sided obligation, for it calls on states both to respect and to ensure respect the conventions. To respect means that the state is under an obligation to do everything it can to ensure that the rules in question are respected by its organs as well as by all others under its jurisdiction. To ensure respect means that states, whether engaged in a conflict or not, must take all possible steps to ensure that the rules are respected by all, and in particular by parties to conflict. Some argue that such an interpretation was not the one originally envisaged by the drafters. They hold that Article 1 was not elaborated with the intention of imposing on states obligations which did not also derive from the other provisions of the Geneva Conventions. While this may be the case, an examination of the Travois preparators reveals that the negotiators at least bore in mind the need for the parties to the conventions to do everything they could to ensure universal compliance with the humanitarian principles underlying the conventions. This is nonetheless a minor consideration, since the historical interpretation of an international instrument can never prove decisive in identifying the current status of a legal norm. Far more relevant in this respect is the meaning conferred by international practice as it has developed since the instrument was adopted. Indeed, over the last half-century the practice of states and international organizations, buttressed by jurisprudential findings and doctrinal opinions, clearly supports the interpretation of Common Article 1 as a rule that compels all states, whether or not parties to a conflict, not only to take active part in ensuring compliance with rules of international humanitarian law by all concerned, but also to react against violations of that law. Moreover, Common Article 1 speaks of an obligation to respect and to ensure respect in all circumstances, making the obligation unconditional and, in particular, not subject to the constraint of reciprocity. It is now widely accepted that the obligation contained in Common Article 1 is binding on all states and competent international organizations. In its recent advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, the International Court of Justice reinforced this assertion, noting that a great many rules of humanitarian law applicable in armed conflict are so fundamental that these fundamental rules are to be observed by all states whether or not they have ratified the conventions that contain them. The same court, in its earlier decision on merits in the landmark Nicaragua case, had specifically demonstrated the fact that the obligation referred to in Common Article 1 forms part of customary international law. In diplomatic circles, Common Article 1 has come to be seen by many as implying a universal obligation for states and international organizations, be they regional or universal, to ensure that this body of law is implemented wherever a humanitarian problem arises. The issue of implementation of international humanitarian law has thus become a more central feature in the activities of states and international organizations. Having set out the scope and content ascribed to Common Article 1, attention will now focus on the various dimensions this provision has acquired over the years. First of all, it is necessary to ascertain, on the basis of contemporary practice, what precise obligations are attached to the obligation to respect international humanitarian law in all circumstances. Emphasis will then be placed on the corresponding obligation to ensure respect. 1.4 State responsibility under international law. If a state violates international law, it is responsible to immediately seize the unlawful conduct and offer appropriate guarantees that it will not repeat the illegal actions in the future. The state also has a responsibility to make full reparations for the injury caused, including both material and moral damages. 1.5 Methods of implementing IHL including national legislations. 1.5.1 National implementation of IHL. One of the major responsibilities entrusted to the advisory service is to ensure appropriate national implementation of international humanitarian law instruments by the states party. Various instruments envisage different types of measures which states party are obliged to adopt to fulfill their obligation under them. Although it is not necessary to outline all of them here, it is apposite to have a look at their summary. 1. To adopt legislation to punish grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and, where applicable, Additional Protocol I of 1977. 2. To protect the proper use of the Red Cross and Red Crescent emblems. 3. To define and guarantee the status of protected persons. 4. To ensure fundamental guarantees of humane treatment and due legal process in times of armed conflict. 5. To disseminate humanitarian law as widely as possible. 6. To train and appoint personnel qualified in humanitarian law, including legal advisors within the armed forces. And 7. To ensure that protected sites are properly situated and marked. The ICRC has been discussing issues concerning national implementation with the authorities of various states in the South Asian region. The usual modalities of dealing with these issues may be outlined as follows. 1. Before embarking on any specific activity or plan of action to facilitate appropriate national implementation, the ICRC deems it expedient to study the existing national legislation of a given country to find out to what extent existing international humanitarian law obligations have already been implemented through national legislation, what legal mechanisms are followed to incorporate international legal obligations in the domestic legal system, and whether the measures adopted so far are adequate or not. Such a national study enables the ICRC to decide upon a plan of action. 2. Where national legislation to make grave breaches and other violations of the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, wherever relevant, punishable has not been adopted, the ICRC requests the authorities to take steps in that direction. Upon request, the ICRC also provides draft model legislation, copies of other countries' legislation, literature on international humanitarian law instruments, etc. This is usually done by involving the National Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. The advisory service also provides support to states in the process of adoption of national legislations under other humanitarian law treaties, such as the Ottawa Treaty banning anti-person landings. Whenever deemed appropriate, the ICRC also organizes events on issues concerning national implementation. Very often these issues are discussed by organizing a roundtable of representatives of different ministries and governmental departments associated with international humanitarian law issues. Such exchange of views is useful for both the authorities as well as the ICRC. 1.5.2 Role of national committees or working groups on IHL implementation, dissemination, and promoting ratification of humanitarian law instruments is an ongoing process which encompasses a wide range of efforts involving many very different fields of government activity and numerous sectors of public life. It requires the coordination and cooperation of various ministries, government administrative departments, state bodies, public service establishments, and other national institutions. In order to facilitate this process, some states have set up special bodies such as national committees or interministerial working groups on international humanitarian law. Their functions are specifically defined in terms of promoting humanitarian law and devising measures for its application. Generally, their objective is to advise and assist governments on matters pertaining to participation in the humanitarian law treaties, adoption of measures for their implementation, and dissemination of their provisions. Although there is no legal obligation to set up such bodies, their creation has been recognized as an important step towards the effective application of humanitarian law. 1.5.3 Dissemination of IHL in civil society. The 1949 Geneva Conventions and their 1977 additional protocols require states parties to disseminate the content of these humanitarian treaties as widely as possible in their respective countries. Of course, their inclusion in military instruction is indispensable to ensure their implementation in times of armed conflict. However, it is equally important to promote knowledge of humanitarian law among those who have to apply it, such as the public officials and various ministers. At the same time, political leaders and decision makers must also be familiar with that law so that they are aware of its relevance, realism, and mode of operation if and when a conflict should break out. Therefore, to ensure respect for it and also to promote its development, it is necessary to include international humanitarian law in higher education. The ICRC has taken a number of steps to achieve just that in the South Asian region. Higher education in most of the South Asian countries is based on the British system. After 12 years of schooling, a student has the option of joining any of the professional courses such as medicine, engineering, or law. There is also the possibility of opting for basic graduate programs in arts, science, commerce, etc. Moreover, a student can switch to professional courses after obtaining a basic graduate degree. Once professional qualifications have been attained, such as a degree in law which qualifies the person of entry into the legal profession as a lawyer, an academic career can be pursued by taking up postgraduate studies and research. Most of the professional course tilde as well as graduate courses are run by colleges affiliated to universities. In most countries of the region, universities are in charge of running postgraduate courses. Educational planners in the various South Asian counties have by and large agreed to include international humanitarian law and political science studies. Following the recommendations of the Association of Indian Universities, most of the Indian universities have included international humanitarian law components. India undergraduate LL.B. program, postgraduate MA, defense and strategic studies or military studies, courses, and postgraduate diploma as well as masters courses in human rights. About 30 universities offer postgraduate course in international law. Of these, 20 universities offer a full optional course in international humanitarian law. The ICRC, through its regional delegation in New Delhi, is closely involved in promoting international humanitarian law in academic institutions in South Asia. As a part of this endeavor, the regional delegation 1. Regularly organizes a South Asian teaching session on international humanitarian law for postgraduate students and young university lecturers. 2. Supports research and publications in this field. 3. Publishes a journal on international humanitarian law in collaboration with the Indian Society of International Law, and 4. Organizes academic events on specific aspects of international humanitarian law, such as the International Criminal Court, the 1977 Additional Protocols, anti-personnel landmines, etc. The delegation also accepts students for internships, has established a documentation center in its premises, supports libraries of academic institutions by providing publications on international humanitarian law, holds moot court and essay writing competitions, and arranges other promotional events. It regularly organizes training programs in international humanitarian law for academic staff teaching law, international relations, human rights, etc., who give courses on the subject at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Since 1999, together with the Indian Academy of International Law and Diplomacy, it has launched a postgraduate diploma program in international humanitarian law. It is essential that international humanitarian law should be known by those who will be called upon to apply it, namely, the combatants. Although states assume obligations under humanitarian law by virtue of being a party or because of the customary law character of the specific norms of this law, it is essential to see that these obligations are fulfilled by putting them in practice, especially in times of armed conflicts. Training members of armed forces in humanitarian law in peacetime is absolutely indispensable to ensure that, as and when they are involved in an armed conflict, they already know what humanitarian law norms they are expected to respect. it is equally important to impress upon them that they shall be held accountable individually in case of failure to adhere to humanitarian law norms. At the same time, they must also know what they are entitled to in certain eventualities with regard to the protections contemplated by humanitarian law, although by virtue of provisions in the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, it is the responsibility of states parties to include the study thereof in their program of military institution. The international community has entrusted a responsibility to the ICRC to help the states parties in fulfilling this obligation. Under humanitarian law, the second phase of the ICRC's program for promoting international humanitarian law among the members of armed, paramilitary, and police forces began in the year 20,000. Its main thrust is on training the trainers in respective countries and ensuring the systematic inclusion of international humanitarian law in the programs of military instruction. The ICRC has already been assisting the authorities in developing and producing training syllabi for the various levels of military instruction. This is also complemented by production of audiovisual and written material on humanitarian law especially designed for use in military instruction. Finally, it is important to note that it is ICRC's policy to disseminate humanitarian law to combatants belonging to all sides in a conflict, in an internal armed conflict, or strife. This means addressing the rebel groups which are fighting with the government forces. They must also know what restraints they ought to follow in the course of their fight against the state. For example, in Sri Lanka, the ICRC has been regularly conducting training in humanitarian law for various cadre of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE. The ICRC is convinced that the program of dissemination and training in humanitarian law for members of armed, paramilitary, and police as well as the non-state actors is bound to enhance greater respect for humanitarian law on the part of combatants and authorities. Promoting humanitarian law is an arduous task. The most important aspect of this process is that it is the obligation of state parties to humanitarian law instruments to take appropriate steps as envisaged by those instruments. An organization like the ICRC can only facilitate this process, and that too, if the authorities of the states concerned are wholeheartedly willing to act in a spirit of cooperation with the ICRC. The ICRC has, in accordance with the mandate entrusted to it by the international community, taken a number of steps to facilitate this process on different fronts and at different levels in South Asia. Dissemination of humanitarian law in civil society, to political authorities, to members of armed and security forces is one such step. The advisory services programs and activities for facilitating national implementation of international humanitarian law and encouraging ratification of or accession to humanitarian law instruments has contributed to the promotion of international humanitarian law. Frequent consultations with national political authorities, preparation of draft national legislation, and discussing issues in the civil societies of various countries of the region has undoubtedly yielded positive results. The most basic prerequisites for greater success in this humanitarian endeavor of the ICRC is wholehearted cooperation on the part of national authorities, support of the National Red Cross or Red Crescent societies, and genuine involvement of the civil society. 1.6 Military Manuals. armed conflict results in the deterioration of the material conditions of life and causes the total or partial destruction of collective infrastructure. International humanitarian law, IHL, refers to the whole body of rules enshrined in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and its two additional protocols 1977, together with other rules designed to ensure protection and respect of human beings in armed conflicts. Implementation covers all those measures which must be taken to ensure that the provisions of IHL are fully respected. Implementing humanitarian law means putting this law into effect. Law of war or law of armed conflict, LOC, consists of international prescriptions on the conduct of combat and protection of victims of combat. What is interesting with regard to IHL is the fact that treaties themselves provide for a number of ways and means of adjustability to ground realities, which is aimed at ensuring that their rules are observed if the situation requires their application. Implementation of IHL may be carried out by the legal processes by means of control and sanctions. Military law plays an active role in prevention by dissemination, designing regulatory measures, and by framing the desired rules and orders to ensure respect and adherence to IHL. 1.6.1 Implementation of IHL. The process of implementation involves keeping a close watch not only on methods and means of warfare in order to assess their consequences in humanitarian terms but also on many other developments that have a bearing on IHL, so as to prepare for the adoption, whenever necessary, of the new rules of that law. Measures designed to assist other states to respect the law, particularly in peacetime, may include providing legal advisors to assist in developing or adapting national legislation and penal codes for effective implementation of IHL, and to train legal advisors within the armed forces, teaching IHL as part of military cooperation, and so on. Respect for the law of war is a matter of order and discipline. A commander is required to assure that his subordinates are aware of their obligations under law of war and that they respect them. Secondly, the commander is expected to make sure that violations of the law of war cease and ensure that disciplinary and/or penal action is taken. 1.6.2 Military Law Advisors. Experts of military law are expected to assume the role of qualified training personnel. The contracting parties are called upon during peacetime to train qualified personnel to facilitate the application of conventions and protocols and, in particular, the activities of protecting powers. Military law advisors may be employed to ensure that IHL provisions are not overlooked. They can be used to advise and instruct the commanders besides participating in general dissemination activities. An insight into the role of legal advisors is provided by Article 82 of Protocol. The high contracting parties at all times, and the parties to the conflict in time of armed conflict, shall ensure that legal advisors are available when necessary to advise military commanders at the appropriate level on the application of the conventions and this protocol and on the appropriate instruction to the armed forces on this subject. Therefore, it becomes the duty of the government concerned to utilize the services of legal advisors. Another area in which the services of the legal advisors can be gainfully employed relates to translation of the IHL instruments in domestic languages and also in drafting of military manuals to be issued for different rank structure of the armed forces. Separate manuals would be preferable for specialists like medical personnel, religious experts, and military police officials deputed to operate prisoner of war camps. The responsibility of superiors and commanders stems from Article 86, Para 2 of Protocol 1, the text of which states the fact that a breach of the conventions or of this protocol was committed by a subordinate does not absolve his superiors from penal or disciplinary responsibility, as the case may be, if they knew or had information which should have enabled them to conclude, in the circumstances at the time, that he was committing or was going to commit such a breach, and if they did not take all feasible measures within their power to prevent or repress the breach. Viewed in that light, officials of the military legal department may be assigned the role of gathering relevant information and providing a legal opinion with regard to allegations about breaches. They may also be tasked to organize consultations with experts to monitor and foster debate on the evolution of humanitarian issues. In so doing, they may rely mainly on the observations in the field to work on factual data. The role of military law towards IHL implementation falls under the category of national measures. Greater significance should be attached to imparting education to members of the armed forces rather than adopting coercive methods for law compliance. An educated soldier is less prone to commit breach of the conventions than a soldier who is ignorant about them. Military law experts have been actively associated in study on customary rules of IHL. They have focused their attention on efforts directed to prohibition of anti-personnel landmines, 1980, Conventional Weapons Convention, and the 1998 Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, ICC. 1.6.3 Punishability of grave breaches of IHL. Grave breaches of IHL may be described as acts which constitute violations of the Geneva Conventions or of Protocol I and are defined as grave breaches by these treaties, Articles 50, 51, 130, and 147 of the four Geneva Conventions of 1949 respectively, as well as Articles 11, Paras 4 and 85 of Protocol I. They consist of attacks against the life or the physical integrity of persons protected by the Conventions of 1949. Grave breaches of humanitarian law are assimilated to war crimes. There are a number of indirect modes in which military law provisions can be invoked to facilitate implementation of LLL. This may be illustrated by the different contingencies where recourse to the Army Act 1950 would clothe the authorities with requisite powers of implementation. An order from a superior commander to his subordinate to conduct classes aimed to disseminate IHL syllabi will be a lawful command, disregard to which may constitute disobedience of lawful command. Similarly, an omission on the part of a student to attend such a class will amount to a culpable act of being absent without leave. The violations of breaches, other than grave breaches, would be punishable under Section 63 of the Army Act that concerns an act or impropriety prejudicial to good order and military discipline. 1.6.4 Military Law of India. India has an international border extending about 16,000 kilometers. Its neighbors include Pakistan, Nepal, China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. It has a coastline of 7,600 kilometers and an exclusive economic zone of 2.2 million square kilometers. It has maritime boundaries with Bangladesh, Malaysia, Maldives, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. There have been a number of wars fought on the Indian subcontinent since it attained independence 55 years ago. Casualty figures of the two opposing sides during these armed conflicts and the proxy war exceed millions. Therefore, Indian armed forces have a visible and real concern for understanding and adherence to the conventions and protocols. The Indian Parliament has legislated upon the Geneva Conventions and the other conventions of humanitarian law to which India is a party. Consequently, the principles of IHL have been incorporated into the law of the country and the conventions form an integral part of Indian law. Section 7 of the said Act is relevant for the purpose of military law. It provides the Army Act 1950, the Air Force Act 1950 or the Navy Act 1957 relating to trial by court-martial of persons who commit civil offences shall have effect for the purpose of their jurisdiction of courts-martial as if this chapter had not been passed. Military law mainly comprises of the Army Act 1950, the Air Force Act 1950, and the Navy Act 1957. The basic framework of these enactments is almost identical. In addition, the Ministry of Defence exercises operational control over the Assam Rifles, governed by the Assam Rifles Act 1941, and the Coast Guard, which is regulated by the Coast Guards Act 1978. The Central Police organizations commonly referred to as the Central Paramilitary Forces, CPMF, are represented by the Border Security Force, BSF, Central Industrial Security Force, CISF, Central Reserve Police Force, CRPF, Indo-Tibetan Border Police, ITBP, and the National Security Guard, NSG. Each of these components functions under their own statute. Item 2. In the Union List of the 7th Schedule to the Indian Constitution recognizes other armed forces of the Union. The Protection of Human Rights Act 1993 defines armed forces to include other armed forces of Union. These are meant to include other armed forces of Union. These are meant to include BSF, CRPF, ITBPF, etc. In the event of war, the CPMF, when deployed on borders or in war-affected areas, may be placed under Army's operational control and would then be treated as assimilated to armed forces in a limited way in the western and northern sectors along the line of control. Paramilitary forces J have been deployed for a long time under Army's operational control. In such situations, they are obliged to comply with IHL provisions as their soldiers assume the status of combatants under law of war. What advantages does the military law offer as against recourse to normal criminal justice delivery system? Military law provisions present a practical and effective mechanism to ensure implementation of the laws of armed conflict. The utility of military law and its efficacy single it out as an effective mode to enforce the law of war. This can be made use of both in a direct manner and also by implication or in an indirect mode. It emerges as a potent and simple tool for fair, prompt, and inexpensive disposal of cases pertaining to IHL violations. Military tribunals are characterized by speedy and impartial trials. They provide a wide variety of rules catering to diverse situations, save for disregarding grave breaches liable to attract award of death penalty or matters warranting joint trial of a large number of offenders. As regards prevention and detection of crime, The military law apparatus recognizes the presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial. The right to privacy is also suitably enshrined. A trial by court martial is invariably economical. The witnesses are unlikely to be influenced or intimidated. They rarely turn hostile. The mode offers a wide range of punishments from which penalty may be imposed. It has elaborate procedures for the pre-trial investigation and also post-trial scrutiny of the proceedings. The system permits pre-trial detention and subsequent confinement within the military structure in the form of detention cells and military prisons. It has a unique advantage of presenting a correctional facility where a convict is kept away from the possibility of becoming a hardened criminal in the company of jail inmates. Promulgation of court-martial proceedings and disciplinary action taken against the offenders is perceived as an appropriate measure towards implementation aimed at ensuring respect for the law of war, while taking care not to give rise to degrading and demeaning retaliation. Regulatory measures are intended to be exemplary and assist in promoting adherence to the letter and spirit of law. Why not depend upon the normal criminal justice delivery system? More often than not, allegations for infringement of the conventions and protocols would be leveled against members of the armed forces. Usually, a civilian may not find himself in a position to commit a war crime. The breaches would relate to situations of armed conflicts or to actual war. Nuances of evidence pertaining to matters like command responsibility, military necessity, or use of excessive force may not be easily appreciated and understood by civilian judges unfamiliar with military ethos. Viewed from that angle, trial based on military law jurisprudence is to be preferred. However, this option has its own limitations. Military law, as one of the law enforcement agencies, is a strictly hierarchical and a closed system. As an organization, it usually operates under a rigid chain of command with strict separation of power and authority. The decision-making processes are of the top-down variety. Moreover, thus far, it suffers from the inadequacy of an appellate forum affording an effective right of personal hearing. Apprehensions are sometimes expressed about the fairness of the military law mechanism to prosecute IHL violations. Such fear is based on the ground of protectionism. It is argued that protection afforded by Sections 45 and 197 of the Criminal Procedure Code may shelter the men in uniform from being called upon to answer charges of criminal prosecution. Such a fear was discounted by the Supreme Court in Naga People's Kesu. The court held the protection cannot be regarded as conferment of immunity on the persons exercising the powers under the said Act, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It only give protection in the form of previous sanction of the central government. Before a criminal prosecution, or a suit, or other civil proceeding is instituted against such a person, it has to be borne in mind that discretionary power is not necessarily a discriminatory power and that abuse of power is not to be easily assumed where discretion is vested in the government and not in a minor official. It is too often said that IHL has no teeth, but if it is the case, it is mainly because states have refused to give it the set of teeth which it could use to bite 12. The jurists have felt a need for IHL implementation to be more effective. Accordingly to Rangnath Misra, former Chief Justice of India, there should be a body permanently set up to review the situation, indicate Further regulatory measures to develop general respect for international law. Some supplementing body should be available so that enforcement becomes more and more practical. On account of the fact that there is a total lack of enforcement machinery, consent cannot be the enforcement machinery. The law takes the idea of making it obligatory and enforceable. Enforceability and consent do not go together. 13. While holding trials, the necessity to conceal and protect the identity of victims or military tactics can be ensured. The results are different when trials are held in the civilian courts. For example, in regard to the allegations about atrocities by the BSF, it was remarked, a large number of cases have been registered against BSF personnel for having taken part in encounters or killed people. Whenever we have been able to identify civilians or militants, adequate action has been taken. It is the weakness of the criminal justice administration system that they are not able to quickly bring them to justice or to punish them the way we would like. 14. Article 91 of Protocol I envisages the concept of payment of compensation. It provides a party to the conflict which violates the provisions of the conventions or of this protocol shall, if the case demands, be liable to pay compensation. It shall be responsible for all acts committed by persons forming part of its armed forces. Thus, quasi-civil sanctions may be imposed on a state to pay compensation for the damage it has caused. Recourse to ordering the payment of compensation is meant to complement the mechanism of penal prosecution. Obligation develops upon a state to pay the amount ordered as compensation. In turn, it would induce its instrumentality concerned, the armed forces, to adhere to the accepted norms of avoid such contingencies. In this manner, the mode of compensation would generate indirect pressure on the troops to abide by the laid down provisions of law. The Supreme Court of India in the Naga people's case paved the way for initiation of criminal action against day offenders while simultaneously giving monetary relief to the victims. Through its humanitarian work, the International Committee of the Red Cross (ICRC) endeavors to provide protection and assistance for victims of armed conflict. The process of national implementation involves a constructive and continuing debate amongst the representatives of various ministerial, civil defense bodies, academicians, and other interested groups like media and NGOs. The meetings are generally held in close cooperation with the ICRC and the national societies. The facilitates progress towards domestic legislation to implement the LOC. The Indian Armed Forces have taken concrete steps for implementation of the dissemination of knowledge on international humanitarian law by making it an essential component of the basic training given to each and every soldier. 1.6.5 Protection of the emblem. The use of the emblems of Red Cross or Red Crescent outside the conditions provided for by the humanitarian law is forbidden. Military law provides authority to the commanders to introduce legal measures for protection of the emblem of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. 1.6.6 IHL Training for military personnel. There is a perceptible keenness on the part of the commanders to train their troops during peacetime for observance of IHL. Military law is inextricably linked to humanitarian law in the matter of training for the defense forces. 15. Directors of military training of nearly all countries in South Asia have sought the expertise of the ICRC to structure their training programs, national seminars, workshops, and capsules are organized to encourage greater awareness of the IHL. The Institute of Military Law, IML, Kampati, near Nagpur acts as the nodal training center for training in Lok. Under the overall guidance of the Judge Advocate General, JUG, suitable exposure is given to the IHL contents in the training courses and promotion exams. Military Law Journal, a biannual publication brought out by the IML, carries articles on issues relevant to the law of war. It carries out a singularly significant function of collection and analysis of all information relating to new legislation and case law. One of the steps presently under active consideration of the JUG's department is production of a training film to propagate the essential message of IHL. Instructions in the form of do's and don'ts have been issued by the Army HQ. From time to time, all soldiers deployed in the disturbed areas are expected to carry the one-page manual in their pocket. They are duty-bound to abide by its contents in letter and spirit. The Supreme Court had commented on its legality in Naga People's Case, Supra. When rules themselves do not contain any guidelines, directions, or criteria, the instructions issued by the government furnish an essential and statutory procedure for the purpose of securing uniformity in application of the rules. These instructions really fill up the yawning gaps in the provisions and are embedded in the conditions of service. These are binding on the government and cannot be violated to the prejudice to the government servant. Adverting to the legality of the do's and don'ts per se, the Supreme Court held that these are binding instructions which are required to be followed by the members of the armed forces exercising power under the Central Act, and a serious note should be taken of violation of the instructions, and the persons found responsible for such violations should be suitably punished under the Army Act, 1950. Recommendations. A number of steps may facilitate implementation of IHL. The suggested recommendations listed below may bring about overall refinement of military law as an option for the prosecution of IHL violations. A. Law governing the Army, Navy, and the Air Force could be suitably amended so that effective penalties are prescribed by way of penal sanctions for breaches of the conventions by bringing them within the list of military offences. I. 49, 11, 50, IL. 129, 4, 146. Appropriate provisions should be inserted in the model law to be drafted so that such breaches could relate to the offences with regard to refugees, hostages, and civilians, etc. An omnibus section could be inserted to cover breaches of Geneva Conventions and the protocols. The heading of such a section may read as Violations of IHL Provisions. B. Specific penalties should be allotted for each of the grave and other breaches. The punishments laid down for various breaches should have a similarity as regards those suggested by the conventions and also in the national legislations enacted by various states for uniform implementation of humanitarian laws. C. More precise and common rules relating to attempt, abetment, and conspiracy need to be adopted. D. The training of the armed forces in LEL should be given an added emphasis. LEL is applied by soldiers from the highest rank of the general down to the lowest sepoy. Dissemination should be carried out in national languages and the texts translated in Hindi so that they can be applied by the population and be easily understood. E. Text editions of all relevant conventions should be prepared and military manuals published so that these can be read and understood by the armed Forces personnel. Military manuals may be drafted to conform to the generally accepted approach of humanitarian norms expected in combat. A modem. Standard treatise of the conventions and protocols should also be developed, with extensive footnotes, commentary, and case law. The advisory service of the ICRC could play a coordinating role in the regard. Particular care needs to be taken with regard to the drafting of the text. These manuals would present an opportunity to include national interpretations of various issues. Military lawyers would then be able to suitably advise commanders at the appropriate level on the application of conventions and about the laws of armed conflict. Setting up of military commissions by the U.S. administration for the trial of Al-Qaeda members alleged to have committed violations of the laws of war is demonstrative of positive and innovative use of military law to enforce law or armed conflict. The conventions and protocols not only encourage states to bring perpetrators of war crimes of justice, they demanded by including means of exercise of universal jurisdiction. 1.7 Summary. Times in this unit, we discussed the meaning of the Common Article 1 Geneva Conventions, state responsibility in case of international law, methods of implementing LEL, and the role of military especially in the context of Indian government. Times the rationale for the purported binding character of international humanitarian law, and in particular Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions and its additional protocol IT, for non-state and groups remains somewhat elusive. Different explanations of why such groups are bound by those conventions, in spite of their not having signed up to them, have been offered, none of them being fully satisfactory. One of the major responsibilities entrusted to the advisory service is to ensure appropriate national implementation of international humanitarian law instruments by the states party. Various instruments envisage different types of measures which states party are obliged to adopt to fulfill their obligation under them. Times military law mainly comprises of the Army Act 1950, the Air Force Act 1950, and the Navy Act 1957. The basic framework of these enactments is almost identical. In addition, the Ministry of Defense exercises operational control over the Assam Rifles, governed by the Assam Rifles Act 1941, and the Coast Guard, which is regulated by the Coast Guards Act 1978. The Central Police organizations, commonly referred as the Central Paramilitary Forces (CPMF), are represented by the Border Security Force (BSF), Central Industrial Security Force (CISF), Central Reserve Police Force (CRPC), Indo-Tibetan Border Police (ITBP), and the